for those who are here, thank you so much for joining our talk on small choices, big barriers, where we're going to share a couple of questions that we can ask to make sure that the research that we're doing is accessible. So I'm Danielle, and I'm here with my colleague, Allie. We both work at Ipsos, where we lead UX research across sectors like healthcare, technology, and e-commerce, doing everything from early discovery to validation. And another big part of what we do on our team is accessibility-focused research. So making sure that digital experiences work for a wide range of users and not just the assumed quote unquote average user. So in recent years, there's been a lot more attention on accessible or inclusive UX. So some of you may have already seen talks about accessibility and inclusive design that give us accessibility 101 tips, or that even present long-term visions for inclusion. And these are both really important topics, but what we want to do a little bit differently with our talk today is zoom in on these small everyday decisions that we make across the research process, and think about how those decisions that we're making might create space for folks or might close it off as well. So we're going to talk through those three questions that can help us reflect on these small decisions so that we can surface subtle patterns, challenge default practices, and create space for a broader range of participants. So before we share those three questions, we do want to set some context for why we're going to ask them in the first place. And the reason is because inclusion is something that can often slip through the cracks. And it's not always due to big, obvious, or even malicious decisions. It often slips through the cracks in quieter and often really unintentional ways. So it could happen when we default to familiar methods, or we're trying to optimize research flows for speed and efficiency. Or maybe we just simply don't have the time to stop and reflect on the different decisions that we're making. As researchers, we do make probably hundreds of small choices throughout the course of a study. So this could be like how we write screeners, what tools we use, how we structure sessions, and even just how we talk about users in our reports. And a lot of these decisions sometimes go unexamined, especially if we're just kind of doing what has worked well before. And because reflection isn't always built into our timelines, even really thoughtful, well-intentioned research can slide into patterns that leave people out without us even realizing it. And so that's why today we want to offer three simple but impactful questions for us to catch those quiet patterns and to look at those choices we're making more intentionally. So I'm going to hand it off to Allie to introduce those questions that we're going to cover today.
Thanks, Danielle. Hello. We'll ask three questions really meant to extend through the research cycle. The first puts us at the beginning of research, allowing us to reflect on how we recruit and include individuals. In this case, we'll be talking about individuals with diverse access needs in our research. The second question will focus on data collection and session planning, thinking about how we moderate or set up sessions or data collection. And the third will allow us to reflect on ways that we are framing participants in our findings. We'll talk about it in report writing, but also kind of overall how we are discussing and framing our participants.
Yeah. So before we dive into our first reflective question, we did want to pause and start with a familiar moment that a lot of us probably experience regularly, because the small decisions that we're going to talk about today don't just live in theory. They happen in real studies and in everyday choices that we make under deadlines and other constraints, and choices that we're often making with really good intentions. So here we have Amy, and she's preparing a screener for a usability study. She wants to make sure that that participants with disabilities are included. So she decides she's going to add a question asking respondents if they self-identify as having a disability. If they say yes, they see a list of categories that they can select, like blind or low vision or deaf and hard of hearing. And she sets quotas based on these categories. So a few things happen during the recruitment process here. So one, a couple of participants check multiple boxes. So for example, one person checks ADHD and mobility-related disability. Now, Amy isn't really sure how these people fit into the quotas that she sets. So just for simplicity, she removes them from the recruit. Meanwhile, another respondent selects no to the question on self-identification and ends up being placed in the Gen Pop group. And during the actual study, when Amy's doing the session with this participant, they share that they actually regularly use magnification tools and that they avoid video calls due to sensory sensitivities. So in this scenario, these choices about how we, like define disability and how participants count ends up shaping who and how shows up in the room. And so that brings us to our first question, which is who gets included in our research and who gets left behind? And this is something we want to ask, obviously, throughout the process, but especially early on at the very start of a study when we're like drafting our screeners and our inclusion criteria. Because we often design our screeners making a couple of assumptions about participants. So one, assuming that they fit neatly into predefined categories, then that they're also going to self-identify using those same categories. And when it comes to accessibility, we might assume that folks have a single fixed diagnosis or experience, or otherwise just assume that they're going to fall into the binary buckets of either I self-identify as having a disability or I do not. And so in reality, we want these clear-cut labels, but they often don't reflect real-world experiences with disability, which can be, among other things, really messy and intersecting. So a person with chronic fatigue and ADHD. They can also be situational or temporary or fluid over time, like someone who has pain or mobility that varies, like even on a day-to-day basis. And also, it just might be something that's not medically diagnosed, or for whatever reason, someone just does not self-label. And so this means that predefined categories that we're using don't always reflect how people see themselves or how they experience disability. So if we base our screeners and our inclusion criteria around really fixed, rigid categories, we risk building studies and ultimately products on a more partial view of accessibility. And so there's some obvious costs to that. And one cost is fewer voices in the room if we're unintentionally excluding folks who don't map neatly onto our criteria. But in addition to narrowing who we hear from, it also limits how we understand accessibility, which means our findings and our designs might end up missing the mark. And so on the next slide, we have a visual to try to capture this and how this narrowing of categories can slowly shrink who gets included in our work. So at the top, we might start a study hoping to hear from people with a really wide range of access needs, but the more tightly that we define our criteria, so for example, if we require a formal diagnosis or if we limit to one type of disability, so the more tightly we define that, the smaller and less representative our participant group might become. And so even if we are trying to be inclusive by adding screener questions like Amy did, if our definitions are too rigid, we may end up hearing from only a small slice of the community. And so that's just an example of how, the small decisions we're making at the prep stage can shrink who's showing up in the room. So I'm going to hand it over to Allie, who's going to talk about how are some practical ways that we can approach this with flexibility and reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So looking forward at tips for inclusive practice, one theme that Danielle just mentioned and we'll speak about often in this presentation is flexibility. Introducing flexibility into your research and building it into your study plan can really help avoid that narrow down that we just talked about. Ways that we can stay flexible and therefore more inclusive include allowing for self-identification and avoiding requiring labels or diagnoses. One example I have of this that I've come across in my research is actually similar to the example Danielle shared. I recently, earlier this year, facilitated focus groups with individuals with diverse access needs, disabilities, and neurodivergence. And one thing that resonated throughout all of the focus groups and all of the research is that many individuals did not identify necessarily as having a disability, but shared really diverse experiences and really essential accessibility feedback. In this study, for example, we had several participants who had autoimmune conditions. These participants used mobility aids sometimes, like canes, walkers, or wheelchairs during flare-ups. And some of them also experienced loss of hearing or vision with their autoimmune condition. However, many of these individuals didn't necessarily identify specifically as having a disability or identify with the labels low vision or hard of hearing. If our screener had only asked about the use of mobility aids or experience of hearing loss after they clicked yes on the question, do you identify as having a disability? We would have missed out on these important perspectives. We also would have missed out if we had required everyone to fit neatly into these quotas for accessible tech usage. Accessibility and disability is highly intersectional, and very few fit into just one category, one experience, or one kind of accessible tech tool. Several of these participants also share that they were unsure if they qualified for studies if, for example, they only use mobility aids sometimes. These are things that we might not always consider when we're doing something like writing a screener. Of course, different studies have different goals and criteria, but by keeping screeners more open and flexible and allowing for multiple ways to identify and kind of enter into this research, we're less likely to artificially narrow that sample. We want to avoid things like gating on a single label or only including those participants that fit into a single category. Finally, pointing to the bottom right of this screen here, it's helpful and important to include feedback when planning out research and beginning recruit. We don't know what we don't know, and inclusion isn't just about who participates, but when and how. So we want to make sure that many individuals, in the disability community talk about nothing about us without us. And it's essential to get some of those perspectives early in the research whenever possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say at this point, we've recruited thoughtfully and hopefully using some of the tips that Allie just shared with us. So we want to remember that inclusion doesn't stop just based on who gets in the door, but it can also show up in what happens once they're in the room. So we want to take a moment, look at another familiar scenario, this time during a research session. So here we have Jess, and Jess is running a remote usability test. So she set it up so it's about 60 minutes long, lots of tasks, and a think aloud component. So it's a pretty typical setup to what a lot of us do. At the start of one of the sessions, a participant shares with Jess that they might need just a little bit more time to process instructions and to think and share their response. So Jess thanks the participant for flagging that and moves right into the session. In about 15 to 20 minutes, she starts to notice some like distress signals from the participant. So they're asking her to repeat questions more often. They're taking longer pauses, their answers are becoming shorter and more unclear, and they're just generally seeming to have trouble navigating the task flow. So Jess is kind of getting anxious, she's not sure what to do, she's looking at her guide, she has a lot that she needs to get through, so she just prompts the participant to kind of, keep moving forward despite all of these, distress signals that the participant is throwing out at her. So the session ends up staying on schedule, but we have this small decision where sticking to the script or sticking to this format came at the expense of the participants' comfort and clarity. And so that brings us to our second question, which is, what are the burdens that we are placing on participants? Because even if we recruit with care, we need to consider what happens once someone actually joins our sessions. Because research designs that might feel really standard for us to use, like a really packed 60-minute interview or a long structured survey, this can actually end up creating barriers that we don't always intend to put up for folks. So we might make a lot of assumptions about people's energy in both directions, but assumptions that they can easily stay focused, respond quickly, or engage fully for an entire session. But those assumptions don't account for things like anxiety or chronic pain or cognitive fatigue, or in Amy's or Jess's participant's case, processing difficulties. And it also just doesn't reflect the energy that it can take to navigate daily life with a disability before folks are even coming to your session. And so the cost is obviously to the participant if there's inappropriate emotional, cognitive, and physical burdens that we're placing. But there's also costs to the research as well. So if a session feels like really exhausting or rushed or just inaccessible, we might have participants drop out completely, but we also might have folks who are disengaging or kind of pushing through discomfort just to get through it. And in the meantime, they're giving us less, or maybe they're even withholding altogether. And either way, we're losing depth and probably more importantly, we're risking losing trust and rapport with our participants. So we want to pause and think about how can we design sessions that make space for comfort, for flexibility, and support. So Allie's going to take us through a few ways that we can ease some of these burdens and still get some really good insights.
Yeah, so here we look for tips for inclusive practice in the data collection phase. And really, of course, bring back that theme of flexibility. In this case, it's really important to bring flexibility into data collection, allowing for things I always recommend, like multimodal options to ensure participants can share. One way I've done this in the past is, if I'm moderating virtually, letting participants go off camera if needed and answer questions in the Zoom chat. I've been able to probe away in the Zoom chat and gotten really great feedback, and it's made participants more comfortable about sharing with me and with our team. It might also be helpful to build in breaks, as Danielle mentioned. This could be, allowing folks to pause and exit out of a survey and come back, or if moderating in person. I'll give an example. I was moderating in person last year for a pediatric medical study. There were lots of tasks. One of my participants was a parent-child dyad, and the child had autism. During the session, we set up specific breaks and communicated when those breaks would be. So saying something like, how about we do another break in 15 minutes where we can jump and shake our energy out? This way, the participant knew what to expect and was more comfortable with the tasks. We ended up getting a lot of great feedback from them. One thing I will add as well is that a lot of this is about making assumptions, and we also don't want to underestimate participants or make assumptions about what they can't do. One example that I had of this experience was conducting sessions with deaf and hard of hearing participants. We had several participants who were deaf and used ASL to communicate. And towards the end of the week of data collection, we had our ASL interpreter cancel and our backup fall through. That could be like a whole other talk, but it was just a series of unfortunate events there. And I assumed on behalf of the participant that we would simply need to cancel. So the night before, when I found all this out, we went ahead, talked to the recruiter and let them know. The participant actually reached back out and shared that they were really excited about the session and that they wanted to continue. Again, here's that flexibility piece. I was able to get to the facility early. We set up a live transcription tool, like with a smart device, I think it was a phone or a tablet, that allowed for live transcription and a typing surface. And then we screencast that to a really large TV in the test room. That way we were able to have the moderators be transcribed live, and then the participant was able to type along with, all of this kind of nonverbal communication that was able to happen in person. And it ended up being like an awesome session. It was super informative. The participant was so great and so willing to share and excited to share feedback. And here, I'm not suggesting that we push participants to work around requested accommodations, quite the opposite, but rather sharing an example about kind of being flexible and involving users in the process, right? We can uncover things we may have missed and learn that our assumptions might have been wrong about what participants can or can't do. Finally, I just want to call out this last box here, acknowledging the labor. In this case, I took time, my client, co-moderator, and I really took time to thank the participant for their time and flexibility. Other times it may be important to just hold space for participants, as sessions might be emotionally or physically taxing. So recognizing these participants and their efforts can really go a long way. Yeah. Right. Next, we'll move on to kind of the reporting stage.
Yeah. So at this point, we've looked at who's getting into the room and what's happening once they're there. But of course, inclusion doesn't just stop when the session ends. So we want to also think about how it does or maybe doesn't show up in how we tell the story of what we heard and saw during those sessions. So here we have our final familiar moment with James. So James just wrapped up field work with blind and low vision users who also use screen readers. He's writing up his findings in a report, and in that report, he notes that participants, most of them failed to locate the enroll button. And the report concludes that the users enrolled incorrectly by bypassing that button. Now, what the report doesn't mention is that during the sessions, most of those same participants continued with the task anyway, and that most of them were able to figure out workarounds and use strategies to still move forward and complete the task. They just didn't click that particular button. So ultimately, the report and the language that it used centers on the user as a problem and also skipped over these creative workarounds that folks were using to still progress in the task. And so that brings us to our last question, which is, how are we framing participants in our findings? Because the way that we write and talk about users is going to shape how are other people understanding them, and then what is getting built as a result. So here's where we want to pause and think about, what happens when we usually sit down to write up our findings. Because oftentimes our research stories center around friction. So we're writing about what didn't work, where were folks struggling. And this is really important. We are not advocating to not write about pain points. Of course, we want to highlight that. But if it's all we focus on, we risk telling an incomplete and even a one-dimensional story of what happened if we're just focused on what participants couldn't do or where they went off track. And so we might miss insights into how they adapted and how they still found their way forward. And so this comes at a cost if we're not paying attention to these, workarounds and adaptations, because if we only highlight breakdowns, we're overlooking the ways that users are problem solvers. And we lose opportunities to learn from lived experience, especially those participants who are constantly adapting around inaccessible designs and inaccessible systems. And those adaptations aren't just workarounds, they reveal unmet needs and also potential really innovative design ideas. So Allie is going to share a few ideas with us about how we can counteract this and frame participants with more nuance and more respect.
Yeah, definitely. So when we are talking about participants in the reporting stage, but kind of also throughout, I kind of want to highlight all of these, both in the reporting stage, but throughout the research. It's important, as Danielle mentioned, to focus on the user and the technology, and not only on failures and pain points. First, again, I think this is a really great perspective for overall inclusive research practice. And thinking of this kind of on the meta level, it means not only including participants with diverse access needs for usability testing at the end stage of product development, to point out where things are already wrong, and focus on those pain points, but also including these participants early in development and not only siloed in accessibility work. And that's my little side note there. But for reporting specifically, again, as Danielle highlighted, understanding accessibility barriers is inarguably essential and an important part of UX research. But there are so many assumptions or snap judgments we may make that can ultimately be damaging. The example that Danielle shared is very close to some experiences I've had, especially with newer researchers. One example is I was doing a study with some blind and low vision participants, and a new researcher working on supporting the report talked about this exact issue, right? Framing the pain points as the users failing to locate this enroll button and doing it wrong, essentially, was the framing. In reality, we actually saw some really interesting workarounds that were able to tell us much more about kind of this onboarding or enrolling experience, much more than what this 10 out of 12 participants failed information was telling us. So in reality, a lot of participants did things like searching their web browser and being able to kind of bypass that enroll button by using Google and getting to that enroll page directly. By learning from these workarounds, the clients actually better understood kind of how to index some of those pages in search engines, in addition to fixing the enroll button, right? It's not like that pain point went away and it needed to be labeled with alt text. It needs to be better labeled as a button. It needed to be able to be tabbed to for anyone using a keyboard or a screen reader. But we actually learned a lot more by learning about those workarounds instead of just framing them as failures. We also want to include preferences, interests, and delights. In the focus groups that I was talking about earlier, I heard many participants share that they are included in research only to give that accessibility point of view or to basically point out what's broken. But these people have thoughts on the overall design, ideas for future use cases, and moments of delight as well, and often want to share them. So making sure that we're including those preferences, interests, and delights in our findings or in our research design overall is essential as well. One example I'll share is also an experience I had with a client. I worked with a really wonderful client and well-meaning, but the client happened to include a question in the moderation guide and kind of in the reporting outline that really assumed that participants hated and wanted to get rid of their existing accessible tech or tools. So basically, like, imagine you're throwing out your screen reader. Or imagine, that you don't have to use it anymore. And in reality, these tools help, these tools and accessibility resources help users access different environments and experiences. They're not necessarily problems to be fixed. So that's just another example of ways that we might overemphasize friction or pain points rather than kind of learning from experiences. So I'm hoping that these tips will be a starting point for researchers to think of participants more holistically and reflect on the ways that we frame them in our research as a whole and reporting in particular. As we kind of start to wrap up today, we have some final points of reflection, and then we can answer any questions. So again, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We're happy to maybe stay a minute or two after too. But the first is that exclusion can happen quietly. Often it's easy for us to go on autopilot and think that we are just working in the ways that we do research every day. However, this can risk leaving people out and narrowing our pool, making our research less inclusive. The second point here is the one I like to drive home a lot, and that is that inclusion is a practice, not a special case. These questions and these approaches really apply to all research, not just some siloed accessibility research. And these questions can actually really be asked about all kinds of inclusion for all kinds of users and all kinds of research. Finally, reflection reveals what we've overlooked to help us expand access and really shift the way that we work to thinking about inclusion from the very start of research design, all the way through the reporting process. Danielle famously said when we were talking about this, setting up this research or this presentation, that inclusive research is good research. And we hope this was a helpful look into ways to slow down, reflect, and consider all of those small decisions that we make. All right, thank you so much it looks like we do have a question in the Q&A. It's loading up.
Yeah, it looks like someone asked, have you used Zoom's survey feature to ask questions?
Danielle, have you ever used?
So I haven't, no.
I have before in focus groups, and it's worked okay. Zoom tends to be actually pretty accessible overall, as far as if someone's using like a screen reader or able to tab through. What I try to do is to verbalize if I'm putting a survey feature into the chat, and then that way for especially blind and low vision users or anyone who is using like tab controls or sip and puff, usually they have to use a shortcut to kind of get over to that chat and access that question. So it's good to just kind of flag it audibly. And then I also will usually put the text of the question into the chat separately. Just have it kind of be redundant. That way that they can read the question overall and kind of consider it and then respond to the survey. So I do a little bit of kind of duplicative work when I do that overall. I hope that answers your question.
Well, then we have Chris. Hi, Chris. How do you decide which types of disabilities are the most relevant to recruit for within a given study?
Yeah, that's a great question. This might be Danielle, feel free to chime in. This might be an unsatisfying answer, but it depends on the study, right? I think part of what we're advocating for is just to have diverse experiences, diverse access needs kind of built into all studies, I think is the goal for many researchers, or the direction that a lot of agencies and research teams are heading. But for a specific study, it depends on your research questions to determine who is relevant, just like any study. Danielle, do you have anything that you want to add there?
You took the words out of my mouth. I was thinking like, yeah, it depends. What are the study objectives and goals? And, then inserting that flexibility that we were talking about and ensuring it's not too rigid that we're going to be excluding folks.
And again, I mean, we talked a little bit about like the question, do you identify as having a disability? That question might be appropriate if your sample is individuals who identify as having a disability, right? That is exactly what you're looking at. But often what we're actually looking for is a broader group, and we're artificially narrowing. So it's not that any one sample or one question is perfect for your research, but it's more about kind of like reflecting who do you want to include, and then are you really including those individuals in your research? But thank you, Chris. That's an awesome question.
Yeah, that is good. So we do have our contact information on the screen here, and I believe folks who registered will get a link to the recording. So feel free to, reach out to us if you have additional questions that you'd like to ask. We're happy to chat about this more.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day and Learners Week. Okay.
Yeah.
Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.